Hello and welcome to Literary Notes, a podcast by the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library. I'm your producer, Nathan Ureta, and in this episode we speak with writer Blaine Harden about his latest book, Murder at the Mission, A Frontier Killing, Its Legacy of Lies, and the Taking of the American West. It challenges the story of Marcus Whitman, a missionary who settled near present-day Walla Walla in the 1830s and was killed by Cayuse Indians in what was later known as the Whitman Massacre. Decades later, American expansionists embellished his story to turn him into a hero of the new frontier. But in present day, a reckoning with his place in history is underway. Harden reunites with library volunteer Rachel Glass to talk about it. Here's their conversation.
It is great to be back. My name is Rachel Glass, and with great pleasure, I welcome my special guest, award-winning author Blaine Harden, who is here today to talk with me about his newest book. It's called Murder at the Mission, A Frontier Killing, Its Legacy of Lies, and the Taking of the American West. Blaine Harden is a contributor to The Economist, PBS Frontline, and Foreign Policy. He served as the Washington Post's bureau chief in East Asia and Africa. He is the author of The Great Leader and the Fighter Pilot, Escape from Camp 14, an international bestseller published in 27 languages, and also he was a guest of mine on Literary News several years ago when that book came out. He is also author of A River Lost and Africa, Dispatches from a Fragile Continent, which won a PEN American Center citation for a first book of nonfiction. Blaine Harden, welcome to the program.
Great to be here.
So this piece of history that is the subject of Murder at the Mission covers many themes: religion, racism, truth or lack thereof, propaganda, class warfare, greed, environmental devastation, corruption, murder. It covers such a vast landscape, literally and figuratively. How did you find this story, and what got you so interested in it?
When I was in grade school in the town of Moses Lake in eastern Washington, I was a student who performed in a play about Marcus Whitman. And the play celebrated his heroism and how he saved the Pacific Northwest from a dastardly plot by the British, the Indians, and the Catholic Church to steal the Pacific Northwest from the United States.
And the Canadians also, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
The British Canadians.
Oh, okay.
I remember the play very well. And it was part of the curriculum for the state of Washington. And I'm 70, and virtually everyone who's my age or older and 20 years younger was acquainted with this story about Marcus Whitman and his wife Narcissa and the glorious successes that they wrought in the Pacific Northwest. And I found out about 5 years ago that most of the story was a pack of lies. Lies invented by Protestant ministers, particularly the Reverend Henry Spalding, as part of a very strange and twisted invention on his part to justify himself and to justify the missionary endeavor in the Pacific Northwest. And once I found that out, and I found it out in the library of the University of Washington when I was searching around for another book idea, then I thought, wow, this is a great story. And so then I started digging. One thing that made this story relatively easy to do, given that the breadth of it is more than 2 centuries, is that the people involved at the beginning, the missionaries, were well educated for the time. They were letter writers, and they wrote letters. They wrote thousands of letters to each other and to the missionary outfit back in Boston that had sponsored their trip from upstate New York to the Pacific Northwest. And all those letters are available, and they really give profound psychological insight into what they were doing and why they were doing it throughout the early years of this tale.
Yes, there is information aplenty to be had. And I will also note that you did exhaustive research. At the back of the book, there are 50-plus pages of notes. There's a bibliography. I mean, your sourcing and your research has been exhaustive and thorough, I will say, just from my experience in reading the book. What was your process in pulling together information that spanned from one end of the country to the other, involved the churches, the government, Native American tribes, the media, multiple colleges, and even reaching into the history of the Grand Coulee Dam and the Columbia River? Talk about how you pulled all of that together for this book.
Well, the process was to start with the letters. And at Braille Library at Yale was one of the first places I went to read the handwritten letters of Narcissa Whitman, the original copies. And then all of the letters have been collected, typed up, and put into a database. And Whitman College, which was where I did much of my research in the basement there, they have a local history section. They had that database, which they gave me, and it was name searchable on my laptop. And so it saved me an enormous amount of time. So I moved through that database of thousands of letters, million words, with considerable felicity as a researcher. And then from there, once I got the basic bones of the plot, then I could go off and do the separate parts of the book. A big part of the book is Whitman College. Whitman College, which is probably the best private liberal arts college in the Pacific Northwest. With Reed, I think those are the two best. Whitman College wouldn't exist had it not ran literally with the lie about what Whitman accomplished. And they used that lie to save the college from going bankrupt. And Whitman College has been open about that somewhat. But it makes for a great story, and they helped me mine that story to the credit of particularly of the archivists at Whitman College.
Yeah. So because this whole legend of the Whitmans is based on a lie, and because your job as an author, as a historian, as a journalist, your job is to find the truth. Did the fact that there was so much misinformation that surrounded this story affect your ability at all to get to the truth, or did it affect this journey of truth-finding that you were on?
Well, it wasn't that hard to find out the truth. What's really interesting is that historians around the turn of the 20th century, 1899, 1900, 1901, they exposed the lie. This was, 123 years ago now, and about half a century after the Whitmans were killed, and about 25 years after the lie had swept the country. But what's very interesting about the debunking of the Whitman lie is that most of the United States said, okay, fine, that was a lie. And they stopped paying any attention to Whitman, who at the turn of the 20th century was a very famous figure in America, somewhat on the par with Lewis and Clark. But in the Pacific Northwest, we did not accept the debunking of our hero. We basically pretended that it had not been debunked and went on believing it 50 years after the story was totally demolished by scholars at Yale and another scholar in Chicago. The state of Washington decided in its legislative wisdom to send a statue of Whitman to Washington, D.C. to be prominently displayed in Statutory Hall as the finest example of humanness that had ever existed in the state of Washington. This is 50 years after the story was debunked. So we haven't yet talked about what is true and what is false about Marcus Whitman. And I'll explain that as we go along.
Right. And I will ask you about that as we go along. It's so interesting how the idea of how falsehoods can become knitted into the society or the culture as legitimate facts, which is something that we are experiencing today in this
Yeah.
country, which I wonder if that was also the relevancy of that when you were writing the book, if that was something that was not lost on you.
This book was conceived, researched, and written during the Trump presidency, when lies had achieved an incredible currency in the governance of our country. And what my research showed me, powerfully showed me, I mean, I was very emotional in the research because it was so clear what was going on, is that Americans believe what makes them feel good. They like stories that are simple, action-packed, hero-driven, and sanctified by God. Those are the stories they like to hear, they like to believe, and that they are very reluctant to give up on. This story about Marcus Whitman and his wife is a perfect example that this is not new with Donald Trump. It's woven into the very fabric of how Americans conceive of themselves in a continental nation.
And it's also informing as to why it's not such a shock that happened. Because if that is something that's been the modus operandi of people in this country for hundreds of years, that it could explain why people fell so hook, line, and sinker in 2016 the way they did in 1833 or something.
Yeah, the marriage of hunger for land, of greed, of religion, and of self-justifying myth is really a major part of the American experience, particularly the settlement of the West.
Well, let's talk about the legend of Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, the stars of this fabricated story. Who were they, and how did they end up in the Pacific Northwest, where we set the stage for this story?
Okay. Both of them were born in central New York in the early part of the 19th century. The area that they were born into and grew up in was known later as the Burned-Over District because of the red-hot flames of evangelical fervor that swept over the region and converted a non-churchy bunch of people to really, really deep Calvinist Protestant faith. And those conversions went along with increasing prosperity in New York in the early part of the century, and this desire to spread the word about Jesus and Christianity across the United States and around the world. Missionary impulse was thriving. So in the 1830s, Marcus and Narcissa Whitman became part of a missionary movement, and they headed west. And accompanying them was another missionary, the Reverend Spalding, who was part of the same historical trend. And what's very interesting is the personal relationship between Henry Spalding, Narcissa Whitman, and Marcus Whitman. Before they all left upstate New York to travel together, actually, in the same wagon train to the Pacific Northwest, Spalding had gone to the equivalent of a junior college with Narcissa. She was from a relatively well-to-do family, was blonde, blue-eyed, a beautiful singing voice, and kind of a belle of the ball kind of character, also very pious. And Henry Spalding came from a much different background. He was the bastard son of a woman born out of wedlock herself, and her parents had been born out of wedlock. And he came from the wrong side of the tracks, and he'd been thrown out of a couple houses from adoptive parents. But he managed to toss up in this junior college because he was a hard worker. Anyway, he set eyes on Narcissa Whitman and fell in love with her and proposed marriage. And she looked at him and his, he didn't read very well at that point. He was ill-dressed and uncouth in many ways and had no money. And she said,
that's important.
And she said, "No way, Jack, I'm not marrying you." And he never forgot, and he never forgave. A few years later, Narcissa met a more suitable Dr. Marcus Whitman, who was broad-shouldered and blue-eyed, and he proposed marriage, and they immediately left to become missionaries. And in the interim, Spalding had found himself a wife, a woman named Eliza, who turned out to be by far the best missionary of the bunch. And they all came together in a wagon train to the Pacific Northwest. In fact, they slept in the same tent. And the Whitmans were celebrating their honeymoon as they traveled because they left for the West a day after their marriage. Oh. And it's very clear that she conceived her only child in the tent that she shared with the Spaldings. And Spalding's mental health, which was never that stable, probably just went completely off the off the boundaries when during this time. And Spalding began to bicker with the Whitmans, and he tormented them. Once they came out to the West, Narcissa wrote back to her father in New York and said, "We should never have come west with this horrible man because of his wicked jealousies." So that's sort of the backstory of these two missionaries coming together to bring the Lord to the tribal people of the Pacific Northwest.
Yes, the harmonic, peace-loving Lord. Yes. Now, you mentioned that they came from New York, but wasn't there there was an entity or a group, a commission that sent them, right? Because there was a very specific purpose.
Right.
Beyond just converting to Christianity, right?
Right.
Yeah.
The American Board of Foreign Missionaries, based in Boston, was a group headed by some of the most eminent Protestant leaders in the country. They were wealthy. They were very well educated. Williams, Yale, Harvard. These are the people who ran the country spiritually and economically. And the board had considerable resources and considerable political power. And in New England, these intellectuals, these religious intellectuals, they had seen what was going on with American Indians. Andrew Jackson had begun to clear out tribes from the American Southeast and sending them to Indian country across the Mississippi in the most brutal way, which was appalling to these white Protestant clerics in New England. And so they were sending out missionaries to the West to prepare tribes for the coming of a horde of white immigrants and to teach these Indians, as they called them. The term Indian, as many people know, has become somewhat loaded at this point, but I'll refer because that's the language they used at the time. So they went out to the West to prepare Indian people for the coming invasion of white people. They would teach them the language, agriculture, the religion, how to dress, how to behave, how to be white people, so that they would not be subject to genocide. And this was a fairly laudable motivation, but they were instructed before they left and while they were traveling in letters to be respectful and to be humble and to get along and don't be annoying.
Yes, and also remember their place because they certainly would not be afforded the rights that white people had.
Right.
But they would have to be nice Christian, civil people, et cetera.
And so they went out there with that mission, but they also went out with this incredible sense of superiority. They believed that the Calvinist religion, with its very complicated hoops about how you get saved, was the only way for any responsible human being to think. And whatever the tribes, the Cayuse and the Nez Perce, among whom the Whitmans and the Spaldings settled, they just didn't care about what their religious beliefs were or what their social organization was. They were the most incredibly ethnocentric and arrogant of missionaries. And their behavior throughout what was left of their lives for the Whitmans showed that.
Yeah. Yep. So this catalyst that set this whole story into motion was the murder of Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, which the legend builders called a massacre, and which Native peoples then and later, they bristled at that because that's not the way that they saw it. I mean, according to the Cayuse tribe, there's a different story. Can you talk about how that started to lead to the inevitable of what happened to Marcus and Narcissa Whitman?
So the Cayuse and the Nez Perce, tribes of considerable military power in the Columbia Basin, sort of the border between Washington State and Oregon on the east sides of both states. They invited, actually, and escorted the missionaries onto their land in the hopes that white people, white God, white technology would help them survive the future and have more power vis-a-vis other tribes that they competed with and sometimes raided. And so they were seen as sort of an adjunct to their own powers. And the Cayuse and the Nez Perce and many of the other tribes in the Pacific Northwest were well acquainted with the power of white technology. They'd seen guns, horses, wool blankets, steel knives, pots and pans. All of these things have sort of filtered into the region in the 50 to 100 years before the white missionaries showed up from the East Coast. And they thought the white missionaries would be a part of this. But it became clear, particularly to the Cayuse tribe, that the Whitmans who settled on their land were giving them no particular advantage. They built a very nice farm. They seemed to produce lots of food. They paid no rent. But what really stuck in the craw of the Cayuse was that more and more white people kept showing up every autumn as part of wagon trains. First is a couple hundred, and then several hundred, then a couple thousand every year. And soon the Cayuse were totally outnumbered, seeing these wagon trains every autumn. And they wanted it to stop. They wanted the Whitmans to leave, and they began demanding that they leave. The Whitmans were on Cayuse land for 11 years. The demands for them to leave began about 4 or 5 years after they arrived. So there was tension there. And then the precipitating event for the murder of the Whitmans was this, combined with the growing resentment of white settlers surrounding them, was a measles epidemic.
Outbreak.
And measles was, incredibly infectious, one of the most infectious diseases ever known to man still. And it had this peculiar quality of killing virtually every Indian child who caught it. And a lot of American children, they would get sick, but they would not die. And the same for adults.
Was that just because
their
body had built up
some immunities? Yeah. In part from living around domestic livestock. There was some immunity for white people. And the Indians saw this. They saw that Dr. Whitman, who was a doctor using the bleeding techniques that were common then, he didn't understand what caused measles. No one did. But Whitman treated white kids and he treated Indian kids, and Indian kids died. So they
saw Marcus Whitman as a medicine man, right?
Yeah,
and they
had a long tradition of murdering failed medicine men, their own failed medicine men. If they didn't do a good job, they were killed. It was sort of an occupational risk.
And it was a custom. It was their societal norm. So people lived by that and
Whitman knew it very well. In fact, he wrote about it at considerable length, and he knew that he had put himself at tremendous risk by being a medicine man among them if he failed. And he'd been warned not just by the Cayuse, but by the British. The Hudson's Bay Company's chief factor, McLaughlin, had told him, if you want to be a doctor, you got to leave if you fail. Otherwise, they'll kill you. He ignored all of that. In any case, in November of 1847, late November, cold, awful day, the Indians had had enough. The Cayuse leadership had had enough. And so they killed Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, chopped them up, actually used the doctor's own surgical saw to cut open their skulls.
Wow.
Narcissa was the only white woman killed, and 11 other white men were killed along with Marcus Whitman.
And those 11 others, were they part of the Whitman?
They were living at the mission. And some were just happened to have rolled in off the Oregon Trail, and some were living there as various trades, carpenters, blacksmiths, that sort of thing.
But it was, from all accounts from the witnesses or historians from the Cayuse perspective, was that this was not random. It wasn't just a random massacre. There was very specific reasons for why they targeted each of those people.
The Cayuse leadership believed that the Whitmans had poisoned the Indians and were deliberately killing them to take their land. And there were rumors spread by various people that this was happening. But it wasn't just the rumors about measles. It was also the resentment about land and their refusal to leave. The killing of the Whitmans and the 11 other whites was controversial and not a universal sentiment within the Cayuse tribe itself. There was a lot of thinking this is a very, very stupid thing to do because now the whites are going to punish us. And they were punished. And so what's really important to understand about the killing of the Whitmans is that it did have a seismic effect on the history of the United States, because the massacre, like any massacre of whites in the American West, particularly if a woman is killed, if a white woman is killed, it triggered a reaction, totally disproportionate to the actual deed. And so what happened is that the whites who lived in the Pacific Northwest, mostly in the Willamette Valley at that point, they organized an army to go to war and punish all the Indians in eastern Washington and eastern Oregon.
Regardless of their tribal affiliation.
Right. And they also sent a delegation back to Washington, D.C. and said, and the delegation went to the president at the time, Polk, and to Congress and said, look it, if we don't send out a big army, and if we don't make this Oregon country an official territory of the United States, because it was held previously in a joint treaty of occupation with the British, if we don't make this America, they're going to kill every white person out there, which wasn't true, but was a very good argument because there was the evidence of this terrible killing. And Congress said, okay, it is officially, as of 1848, a territory of the United States. And that was a pivot point. And all of a sudden, what would become the states of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho were an illegal part of the United States, subject to federal law enforcement, federal judges, federal governance. And so within a year, all that was in place. And the Indians were tried. 5 suspects were found, whether they were guilty or not, and they were tried and they were hanged in Oregon City. And the trial and the declaration of this area as a part of the United States basically opened the floodgates for settlement. And within 20 years, the Oregon Territory became Washington and Oregon, and later would become Idaho. It had hundreds of thousands of white settlers, and the Indians were minorities on their land, and they were soon pushed into reservations. So that's what actually happened. And so the Whitman killing was very important historically. And the great achievement of Marcus and Narcissa Whitman as historical figures was getting themselves killed, which led to this reaction, which led to a political change and an actual historical movement. But the lie that came out of the Whitman's killing was much different. And it took about 20 years to percolate in the somewhat demented mind of Henry Spalding.
Yes, and I wanted to talk about Henry Spalding, the fellow missionary. Great segue, by the way. So he is the person that is associated with inventing this myth. Now, you mentioned Spalding. He harbored some personal yearnings for Narcissa. He was called by many of his peers a psychopath. Why did Spalding want to start this legend about the Whitmans? I mean, it wasn't about him. This would be a very sort of a magnanimous move to heighten Marcus Whitman, who was his rival for his love of his life. Why did he do that? What was in it for him?
Well, Spalding was a somewhat twisted character, and exactly what was going on in his mind is somewhat hard to understand. But the truth is that while the Whitmans were alive, he tormented them. In fact, they couldn't even live within 100 miles of each other because they got along so badly. He built his mission in Idaho rather than near the Whitmans, which was in between Washington and Oregon, near Walla Walla. But once they were dead, he turned them into legends. And part of the reason is that he was almost killed by the Cayuse 3 days after they killed the Whitmans. He'd tried to travel to the Whitman mission 3 days after the massacre. He didn't know it had happened. And he was just riding his horse there because his daughter was there, and his daughter had become sort of a high school student at the mission where Narcissa was a teacher. And she was a well-educated woman for her time and a good teacher. And so Spalding had sent one of his children, his daughter, to go to school there. And he wanted to check and see if she was okay because he knew about the measles epidemic in the region. He was about to go into the mission when he ran into a Catholic priest, Father Bruyere, who had just been in the mission, and he'd buried the bodies. And he'd learned from the Cayuse. He was a Catholic, and the Catholics were not blamed like the Protestants. The Cayuse really wanted to kill Spalding, too. So when the priest encountered the Protestant missionary on the road, he reached out his hand. They were both riding horses, and he held his hand and he said, "You must run, Reverend Spalding, because the Cayuse they're looking for you. They want to kill you. You must run now. Immediately you must turn your horse around and ride for your life." And Spalding did. And he owed his life to a Catholic priest who warned him to go. Spalding and Whitman were anti-Catholics to their core. They viewed the Catholics as rivals in prospecting for Indian souls.
The collection of subjects, right?
Yeah,
right.
and for Spalding to owe his life to the charity and the compassion of a Catholic priest just drove him nuts because he hated Catholics. So that fact that he owed his life to a Catholic and the fact that the Whitmans were now dead and killed in a most gruesome way by Indians, all this percolated in Spalding's mind for a number of years. But Spalding, besides being a somewhat grievance-driven man, always annoying people, was also a gifted populist demagogue. He could intuit what story would really appeal to religious Americans, to Protestant Americans who basically ran the country. And so he slowly, with the help of other white Protestant clerics, some of whom were educated at Williams and Yale, and were living in the Portland area, they cooked up this story that said that about 5 years before Marcus Whitman was killed, he discovered by attending a dinner that the British were coming, and they had this sneaky plan to take the entire Pacific Northwest for themselves and to push the Americans out. And that once he heard this plot at dinner, Whitman bolted out of the meal, away from the dinner table, and got on his horse and rode to his wife and said, "I have to go to Washington. I have to save the country from these British and from the Indians and from the Catholics." And this is a story that Spalding and his fellow clerics made up.
So basically he threw the Catholics under the bus,
right?
Who had saved him.
Saved his life. And the truth is that Marcus Whitman did ride to the East Coast in 1842, but he did so in his own words and in the words of Spalding's own letters to save the mission from being disbanded by the American Board of Foreign Missionaries. And the reason they wanted to disband the board is because the missionaries were bickering with each other, constantly bickering. There wasn't just the bickering between Whitmans and Spaldings, which was documented in letters. There were 3 other missionary families there, all of whom were writing letters back to Boston saying, "I can't believe how what intolerable, terrible Christians these people are, and I can't believe that we're behaving so badly, and blah blah blah.
And can't believe we're supporting them.
Yeah, and so the board in Boston said, well, fine, let's just spend the whole business. And Whitman was ordered to give up his mission, and that's why he got on the horse and rode back, not to save the country from the British. But this was all twisted by Spalding. And then he started about 20 years after the killing, around 1865 or so, to publish long, dramatic pulp fiction, basically, about bloodthirsty Indians, Catholics and British, who had done this terrible thing. And he pulled together what he called his manifesto, which was a grab bag of lies and nonsense. And he then took a train. Cross-country trains were then available. And so in the early 1870s, he took a train back to Washington, D.C. with his manifesto. And he arrived as this grisly man in his late 60s, a man of God, one of the first missionaries in the West, and a man of impeccable credibility as far as he was viewed by the senators and the power structure in Washington, D.C. So then he gave them his grab bag of lies and nonsense, which the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives published as the official history of the Pacific Northwest. Once it was published, then the Encyclopedia Britannica, virtually every textbook in America that was read by high school and college students, the New York Times, the Ladies' Home Journal, the whole country went crazy for this story, and it became the official history. Spalding returned to the Pacific Northwest, got a job on a reservation, began converting Indians to Christianity like nobody's business. He was the most successful Protestant in converting Indians in baptizing Indians, and then he died. With his lie never exposed. And then it expanded. It helped seed Whitman College. And then, as I said, in 1900, a university student at the University of Washington, an undergraduate, he started thinking that maybe this story was actually just propaganda for Whitman College. Then he got accepted to Yale to study graduate studies there, and he passed on his...
Is this Penrose?
Yeah.
Who became the president of Whitman College
yes,
ultimately.
Right.
Yeah.
He passed on this rumor to a professor at Yale, who then investigated it rather thoroughly. Now, while that was going on, and this is sort of the second third of the book, is that Whitman College in the 1890s was a small, struggling liberal arts college, conceived to be the Williams of the West.
Mm-hmm.
And Williams College is this incredibly elite, wonderful, high-class school in the East Coast. It's the epitome of liberal arts education. And one of its graduates, who had also gone to theological school in the East Coast, he was a pastor working out in rural eastern Washington, and he became president of Whitman College at the point when it was bankrupt. It couldn't pay its teachers. It couldn't pay its mortgage. It was at death's door as an educational institution. And Penrose, he just didn't know what to do. He went into the library. He found a book about the Whitman myth, the book said this was actual fact. And he said, this is the story that will save the school. So he boiled down the Whitman Saved Oregon story into a 7-page pamphlet that was a brilliant piece of
distillation.
Synthesis. Penrose was a very gifted academic and a good writer. And he boiled down the story saying that Marcus Whitman shed his blood so that this university could live and to save the Pacific Northwest from the British and the Catholics and the Indians. The pamphlet then he took to Chicago and to the East Coast, and he raised the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars that saved the college and put it on its path to what's now it's really an excellent liberal arts college. The story was false, of course, but that didn't matter.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about the the Grand Coulee Dam, which was touted as the biggest concrete dam on Earth, which I'm guessing
it was at the time.
At the time, yeah. Now, this, as we move into, the 20th century and we start looking at what is happening to the tribes of that area, what is happening with the environment, the fish and wildlife and the water and all of those things. And, of course, the Columbia River is one of the greatest rivers on the western part of the United States. So the building of the Grand Coulee Dam was connected to how this story played out. It had a huge effect on the access to food sources, to water for the native tribes in the area, as well as, and I thought this was such an amazing fact that I didn't know, the Columbia River had some of the world's longest and healthiest runs of Chinook salmon running up into British Columbia, and this was a distance of more than 1,000 miles. And those salmon just were on it. They knew it. I mean, it was... Anyway, all of this was affected. So can you talk about that as far as one of the greatest arteries of lifeblood for the Native Americans and also for white farmers and everything?
So the Cayuse, along with the Walla Walla and the Umatilla tribes, at a treaty in 1855, they had almost all their land taken away from them by the man who had become the first governor of the state of Washington, Stevens. So they were confined to this reservation, which was a post-stamp reservation. But still, it was their own land and guaranteed by treaty in perpetuity. So the tribes went there, and once they got there, the inevitable happened is that white farmers surrounding them wanted the land inside the reservation. And by hook and crook, over the next 30 years, they took half of it. So the land was divided up in a way that allowed whites to own some of the land and then to lease much of it. And the Indians were bullied and pushed around and demonized for the Whitman massacre for a century. The main river that goes through the reservation, the Umatilla River, it was dewatered. The treaty that gave them the reservation guaranteed the right to that river and to the fish in it. But the language of the treaty was ignored, and irrigators put their siphons into the river and small dams into the river, and basically it dried up. It never reached the Columbia. It basically flowed out of the Blue Mountains and was sucked into irrigation fields. So all the salmon that were in that river that were a key food source and also a source of the religious beliefs of the tribes, they disappeared. This happened in the early 20th century. So all of the people on the reservation who are now alive and were alive throughout the 20th century, they never knew any salmon until the end of my story. So this was going on, and once the dams started to be built for irrigation, the small dams, there was a period of federal overreach in the Pacific Northwest, and it began with Grand Coulee Dam. Grand Coulee Dam was conceived during the Great Depression as a jobs measure, Franklin Roosevelt, and also a way to bring cheap power to a region that was in need of something to spark growth. And so Grand Coulee Dam was built in the late 1930s, early 1940s. My father worked there. I wrote a book about the Columbia River.
And didn't you?
I worked there as well. I was fired for complaining about safety conditions when I worked there in the early 1970s. So the dam was built, and it came online at precisely the best moment in American history for a huge, huge load of electric power. World War II had started. And so power from the dam built bombers for Boeing. It built ships that in Portland. But most importantly, it funneled a secret load of power, more power than was used in the entire Pacific Northwest, to a secret nuclear plant at Hanford, which was building a factory to produce the plutonium for the bombs that were dropped over Japan.
Nagasaki.
Yeah, and Hiroshima.
Oh, both of them.
Actually, it was the plutonium that was dropped over Nagasaki came from Hanford. But then the entire buildup of the American nuclear arsenal was fabricated at Hanford. And it would go on to become, in peacetime after World War II, the primary factor for the Cold War buildup. And it also was an incredibly messy, secretive, and poisonous mess.
Yes, there was leaks and spills.
And American taxpayers are still spending many billions of dollars a year to clean up the mess, which continues to leak into the Columbia River.
Was this the event that at this time during the 30s and 40s that we are still addressing, or was that a different?
The buildup, the buildup to create the plutonium triggers for the Nagasaki bomb happened in the 40s. It was a rush thing to do, build this huge factory. But then the factory continued to produce plutonium at huge levels throughout the 50s and early 60s.
And was that because of the Cold War? Or
Cold War, yeah. And it created an enormous environmental mess. And and it goes back to Grand Coulee, and the people who were in charge of river development and the general development of the West, they saw, well, this big dam at Grand Coulee was a great idea. So let's build 247 more big dams on the Columbia and its tributaries. And so virtually every inch of dammable water in the Pacific Northwest was dammed. And some of those dams destroyed prime Indian fishing sites on the Columbia, which were downstream from Grand Coulee and still had salmon. And the Cayuse, Walla Walla, and Umatilla tribes were impacted by this rush to pour concrete and throttle rivers. Another interesting development is that the Army, in its wisdom, decided to put a nerve gas repository right on the edge of the Umatilla Reservation. And then once they decided they didn't need the nerve gas in the 70s, they decided to burn and destroy all the nerve gas there, which it was, this is some of the most toxic and dangerous chemicals known to man. So this was all placed next to the reservation when the Indians had no say. So the torment that began with the dispossession after the killing of Marcus and Narcissa Whitman for the Cayuse and some of these other tribes.
I would say even it started before the murder of Marcus and Narcissa Whitman.
The torment continued to be compounded by federal policy. Now, the tribes had one ace in the hole, and the last part of my book is about how they exploited it. And I think that it gives the story a pretty, I think, uplifting ending. And the ace in the hole that the tribes had were the federal treaties that they signed. And those treaties, ratified by the U.S. Senate, official federal law, said that the tribes had the right to the land and to the resources on that land and to their usual and accustomed places outside of the reservation to fish and hunt and gather.
And they also had a pretty ingenious lawyer, right, who was on their side and was able to
In the middle of the 20th century, they lawyered up. For the first time, they got good legal advice. They used power under federal law to create their own self-ruled government. It took them about 30 years to figure out how to manage the power they had because of lack of education. What happened
was... And
was...
lack of interest. Weren't they unable to get quorums at some of those meetings so they couldn't vote on things?
Federal policy had depopulated the reservations across Indian country in the American West. People were sent to Indian boarding schools, and a very large number of people were sent on programs that were somewhat valuable to many Indians, to cities, to live, to get educated, to actually to sort of
Assimilate.
Mm-hmm. But what happened in the 80s and 90s was that some of these members of the Umatilla Reservation, Cayuse, Walla Walla, and Umatilla, they decided to come back to the reservation, back to the res. And they brought with them skills. Many of them had college degrees. Some were becoming lawyers. Some were becoming fish biologists. Some were becoming land use planners. Mm-hmm. And Anton Mintorn, one of the heroes of my book, was a land use planner, as well as a former, I think he was a Marine, and he had studied community organization in San Francisco, where a lot of American Indians had gone. And so he came back with some real skills, technical and political, and he was also a natural leader. And
wasn't his father also?
His father was a veteran from Korea, from World War II, and he'd also gone to college and became a civil engineer, and had tried to use the power of Indian government to create wealth-generating businesses on the reservation, but he had largely failed. And Anton was more successful, and another Mintorn on the reservation, he helped bring lawyers back. The man who had become the chief judge on the reservation, he brought back. But then something very valuable for the Indians happened in Washington in the form of Richard Nixon.
That was amazing.
It's sort of a great irony that the savior, in many ways, of the Umatilla Reservation and many other reservations around the country was Richard Nixon. He was a Quaker. I mean, he was a thief and a liar and a crook, and he tried to subvert the Constitution and all that. But he was sympathetic and understanding of the long history
and advocating.
And
he wasn't just a
for the Indians. And so he made a series of speeches and followed it up with policy that gave the Indians both autonomy and a steady flow of resources to organize a bureaucracy that could help them to use that autonomy to their own good. But that really wasn't the key. The key came in the early 1990s with the Indian Gaming Act, which allowed the tribes to have gambling, casino gambling, and the law was well written in that it prescribed that the resources from the gaming must be kept on the reservation. And for the Umatilla Reservation, as for many of the tribes around Seattle and in many other parts of the country, it has been the most important economic boon since white men showed up in America. And the way I end my book is a couple of the leaders, two men named Mintorn, they like to go to the casino on the Umatilla Reservation, and they go in and order a sandwich, have a Sprite or something, and they sit near the one-armed bandits, the slot machines, and they watch white people lose money. And they think it is the most poetically perfect moment for the punctuation point for all they've endured and suffered and how they've come back. And in truth, they have done a remarkable job in reinvigorating the tribe. It's got more people, it's got more money, it's got more educated kids going off to college and coming back.
Organization.
It's not perfect. There's still a lot of problems, but it's in a much better place than it has been since the Whitmans showed up.
Well, I have my final question to you. We're almost at time, but my final question to you is your book brought a lot of historical facts to life that ended up almost asking some of these entities to answer to what it is you're bringing here, the truth. And, there is some degree of a silver lining to all the devastation that was visited on the native peoples of the Pacific Northwest. Your book is mentioned as a source that motivated people to make some of the recent changes for seismic good. I mean, big level changes. And my question is, did you think or did you know that your book would help to change history? I mean, you have turned over in your book 200 years of the fallout of a lie, and this lie that persisted for 200 years. And your book is bringing about changes. I mean, statues that were taken down, and the administration of Whitman College that are notating your book as a source of what caused it. I mean, that's a pretty big thing that your book did. Tell me what you think about that.
I'm very
that
gratified
changed the
that
world.
that it happened. But my book was part of a zeitgeist kind of change. Another book about the same subject came out a year earlier, actually, but it took a slightly different take. And then the state legislature in Washington decided to remove the statue of Marcus Whitman from Washington, D.C., in the same week my book came out, so I can't hardly claim credit for it. The thing was that the lie had it was time for a reassessment. You know, across the country, statues of Civil War heroes and of various people who didn't deserve statues, maybe, have been questioned and removed from Statuary Hall. It's not just Marcus Whitman. There's this sort of national reassessment. In the wake of the George Floyd killing, in the wake of an examination of white
privilege and oppression,
right? Yeah. And so this, journalists. I consider myself to be a journalist, and I think I just sort of swim in the same waters, and I just did this thing that other people were doing at the same time. However, the book did push Whitman College to create 5 full scholarships for kids from the Umatilla Reservation, which is a great thing. Excellent college. So that's good. And the National Park Service is now led by one of the sources of my book. Chuck Sams is the director of the National. He's the first tribal person to have that job. And Deb Holland, from New Mexico, is head of the Department of Interior, the first tribal person to have such a job. Now, that doesn't have to do with my book, but there is a moment right now in our history where we are reassessing, rethinking. And one of the things about the history of the United States is that the truth is so much more interesting than the lie. The lie is banal and it doesn't really it's kind of ridiculous. But the truth is nuanced, it's human, and it's much more
ongoing.
Fun. Yeah. And
this is the idea of ongoing because, okay, yes, this law happened the same week that your book came out. I, of course, am looking at the big picture because your book is forever. Your book is now to be out there, to be read. I mean, people have just started to read your book. I mean, imagining how far the reach of your book and what it means and that the trajectory we are on. I mean, that's what I'm saying. I'm looking at the trajectory and how your book is a tributary into the wide Columbia River of where we're headed as a country.
I've spoken to some eighth graders.
Amazing.
Eighth graders in Washington State is in eighth grade is when you study state history, and I've spoken now to eighth grade classes in several parts of the state where they're learning this more interesting, truthful story about the past, and they're pretty darn interested and taken by the injustice and also by the picadillos of the characters. So that's terrifically fun.
Well, I want to give you all the propers that come with this book because it was such an eye-opening education for me in reading it. And it was so far-reaching and just touched on so many different aspects of this country's history and this country's present and this country's future that I just feel like the more people that read it and the more that it becomes received as part of American history and that, you're an author, you're an investigative journalist, but you're also helping to create our history and where we go from here. I just was quite taken by that. So with that, Blaine Harden, I thank you so much for being here today. Again, if you're just tuning in, or if you haven't gotten enough exciting appetite for this book, it's called Murder at the Mission, A Frontier Killing, Its Legacy of Lies, and the Taking of the American West. Thank you so much for this conversation, for being here today. And where can folks get this book? Anywhere that books happen? Amazon,
yes.
Purchasing,
Yeah.
bookstores,
Yeah.
or downloading? Go read this book. It is quite enlightening. And you don't have to be from the Pacific Northwest to appreciate this book because, again, it touches on aspects of our country nationally, from East Coast to West Coast and all points in between. Thanks again, Blaine Harden.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Blaine Harden's book, Murder at the Mission, A Frontier Killing, Its Legacy of Lies, and the Taking of the American West, is in the catalog of the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library. It's available as an audiobook with the class ID DB110171. Thank you for joining us for the second episode of Literary Notes, by the way. I hadn't said this in the previous episode, but we're trying to upload an episode every other Thursday, which means the next episode is scheduled to go out on Thursday, February the 20th. We hope you'll tune in then. If you have any questions or comments about the library, or to see if you're qualified for our services, visit WTBBL.org or call us Monday through Friday from 8:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. at 206-615-0400 or toll free at 800-542-0866. Literary Notes is a production of the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library based in Seattle, Washington. This episode's interview was conducted by volunteer Rachel Glass. I'm your producer, Nathan Ureta. Thanks for listening.